My name is David Gariff. I'm a senior lecturer here at the National Gallery, so welcome. This is the second special lecture that I'm presenting in conjunction with the Impressionist exhibition that's currently on view. My lectures have not been an overview. Some of my colleagues are doing that, but my lectures have focused on different aspects. My first lecture traced essentially the history of the Impressionist exhibitions from that original one that is currently the subject of our exhibition, 1874. But the last exhibition of the Impressionists was 1886. And so I talked a little bit about the entire sort of history of the Impressionist exhibitions. Today, I'm going to focus more tightly on two individuals who are certainly important to the development of Impressionism, one as a painter and one as a writer. And that is, of course, Edouard Manet and Émile Zola. So here on the screen at the moment are two paintings by one of the most well-known and highly regarded academic painters. And that exhibition that if you've attended it, you'll notice that it kind of juxtaposes these more academic painters. And these are two paintings by William Adolphe Bouguereau, The Song of Angels on the left from 1881 and The Virgin with Angels on the right from 1900. I chose these paintings specifically because they show angels. And what we have set up at this time is before even the Impressionists come on the scene, so even in the 1860s, we have a kind of dichotomy between the idea of academic painting and the subjects appropriate for academicians, and then the growing interest in realism. And so here, looking at two paintings that are by one of the great academics, we have to only remember the quote that came from Gustave Courbet, quote, "I have never seen an angel, show me an angel, and I'll paint one." That particular idea was very germane to the young Vincent van Gogh, who wrote about it actually in a letter to his brother Theo. So clearly Courbet was not into painting angels unless he could see one literally walking down the street. So this is Courbet's The Stonebreakers from 1849. So we're some 30 years before Impressionism. This is one of the most important paintings in European 19th century art history. Unfortunately, it was destroyed during the Second World War when Dresden was bombed. So the Stonebreakers became a kind of clarion call for the movement called realism, which emerged in the 1840s and really lasted into the 1880s, into the time of the Impressionists. And the aim of realism, as the term implies, was to give truthful, objective, and sort of impartial representations of the real world. So that quote, again, of Courbet about an angel. Realism was also, though, had a political and social agenda. It was fundamentally tied up with the egalitarian values of the French and the American revolutions, with the Revolution of 1848, and of course with the founding of the French Second Republic, which lasted until 1851. Courbet was one of the most politically active painters of his day, and ultimately for that reason he was actually banished from France. Now, the relationship between writers and artists for Impressionism and prior to Impressionism is very important. You can't ignore any of these individuals when you study 19th century European art history. So three of the most important writers are here on the screen. From the left, the writer which just went by the name Champfleury, that's a photograph from around 1860. In the center, maybe the most important in some ways of the writers, is a portrait of Charles Baudelaire from 1862, and then that is a photograph, a portrait of Courbet on the right from 1863. So Champfleury was a French art critic and a novelist. He was a prominent supporter of the realists. Baudelaire, of course, in 1846, wrote one of the most important essays in 19th century French aesthetics, which he titled On the Heroism of Modern Life, in which he rejected all of the ideas that painting should revolve around portraying allegory, mythology, religion, history, all of these distant subjects that had nothing to do with the here and now, and subject that most people couldn't figure out what it is, even if you told them the title. So he felt that that was simply not in keeping with the desire for something to reach to a broader audience. Courbet was not born in Paris, he was born in Ornans, so he had a sort of rural background. And for that reason, he somewhat presented himself as an unsophisticated person, but that was just a total fraud and pose. He was incredibly sophisticated and well-read. And it's his work that essentially started to create this new movement towards what we now call realism, something that rejected not just the academic traditions, but the exotic themes of romanticism, so paintings by Delacroix or Géricault. It certainly rejected idealized classicism, paintings by Ingres and Jacques-Louis David, and it was looking for something very, very new. As again, Courbet made a statement in 1861 saying, quote, "Painting is an essentially concrete art and can only consist in the representation of real and existing things." Now, this battle between the academicians and the classicists, or between it played out in a number of different ways. The academy versus the realists, the classicists versus the realists, etc., is sort of beautifully sort of caricatured here by Honoré Daumier. Daumier's print here, it's a lithograph. It's titled "The Combat of Schools: The Duel of Idealism and Realism." So in 1855, Daumier was well aware of this dichotomy, this friction, and these debates between the classic and the realist. And so he shows here this realist painter who's here, who looks very dumpy and frumpy. He wears wooden shoes. He's a peasant. His vest is too small. He has a palette, but he has a gigantic brush with these big bristles that you could probably paint a house with. And against him is this thin figure representing classicism or idealism. He wears a helmet that echoes the Greeks and the Romans. The palette he uses as a shield. What he's using as a spear is, of course, a maul stick. Do y'all know what a maul stick is? A maul stick is a stick that painters in the academic tradition, or any painter who wants to have a very tight, controlled brushstroke, doesn't want his hands shaking. So he'll have a stick that has a little sort of soft end to it, a little kind of puffy, and so that he can put the maul stick against the painting, it'll go down to the ground, and then he can put his arm on top of the maul stick, and that will prevent him from shaking. So what the maul stick was used for were for painters who particularly wanted to create paintings that looked almost photographic, where you couldn't even sense that, in fact, they had been painted. And that was truly the addition, that truly was the aspect of the Academy that everybody was familiar with. They used to call paintings like that, or when they described their surfaces, critics sometimes referred to those surfaces as having been licked with one's tongue to get rid of any kind of sense of brushstroke. Now, Courbet was unique and had a unique concept of himself. This is a self-portrait on the left of Courbet called The Desperate Man from 1843, and then another self-portrait, Man with a Pipe, from 1848-49. Courbet executed about 20 self-portraits, and you can trace his sort of feelings about things as you follow through with them. Courbet was a rabble-rouser. He was a rebel. He was a renegade. He was a political activist. He had strong opinions about everything. And most of the times when he expressed the opinion, he believed that his opinion was the only one that counted. He exhibited a number of these self-portraits at a retrospective of his own work that he staged at what was called the Pavilion of Realism, which I'll talk about in a second. And when the critics came to see that exhibition, because there were close to 20 self-portraits, one critic came away simply saying, quote, "Courbet waving, Courbet walking, Courbet everywhere, Courbet forever." Now, Courbet produces some of the most iconic paintings of realism. The Stonebreakers is first and foremost, but then this very large painting, A Burial at Ornans. Ornans is the town where he was born. And then it has this very long explanatory subtitle, A Painting of Human Figures, The History of a Burial at Ornans from 1849 to 50. He started working on this painting and he wanted to make it a kind of a manifesto, a statement of his principles about painting. And so he portrayed a burial in his hometown with everybody who could be recognized. If you knew anybody in Ornans, they're all kind of represented here as actual individuals and personalities that Courbet certainly knew. It's a frieze-like composition. It's horizontal. You can just see the sort of cliffs or the mesa, sort of the plateau in the back of Ornans. The only thing that punctures the horizon is the crucifix that you see being held. But what's most interesting is that these people have gathered around this grave, and the grave is actually cut. It's propped here. So the grave actually spills out of the picture frame. And what is fascinating about this picture, of course, is the way that Courbet is asserting not the idea of a religious evocation as much as a real sort of social gathering. You have this crucifix going up on the left, but you have the gaping hole of the grave at the bottom. And so this painting, as most of Courbet's painting, when he exhibited this at the Salon, and our exhibition deals with, of course, the Salon. Courbet exhibited this in 1850 at the Salon, and people, various references to it by critics, it was that it was ugly, it was ordinary, it was anti-clerical, it was heretical, and on and on. Now, maybe to understand a little bit what Courbet was, the tradition Courbet was tweaking, we need to only look at El Greco. So here's El Greco's painting, The Burial of Count Orgaz from 1586. And you'll notice everything in the El Greco is vertical. It goes from the tomb to the heavens to God in the sky. So this painting stresses the transcendental going up and down. Courbet denies this idea and stresses the horizontal of the earth and this gaping sort of hole, as I mentioned, of the tomb or the grave. So this is the period, of course, when we get into the 19th century, everybody starts writing manifestos, and then when you're a graduate student, you have to read all these things. So in Courbet's Manifesto of Realism from 1855, you can sort of read it there, but he says, the title realist has been imposed on me in the same way as the title romantic was imposed on the men of 1830. Titles have never given the right idea of things. If they did, works would be unnecessary. Without going into the question as to the rightness or wrongness of a label, which, let us hope, no one is expected to understand fully, I would only offer a few words of explanation which may avert misconception. I have studied the art of the ancients and moderns without any dogmatic or preconceived ideas. I have not tried to imitate the former or to copy the latter, nor have I addressed myself to the pointless objective of art for art's sake. No, all I have tried to do is to derive from a complete knowledge of tradition a reasoned sense of my own independence and individuality. To achieve skill through knowledge, that has been my purpose. To record the manners, ideas, and aspect of the age as I myself saw them, to be a man as well as a painter. In short, to create living art. That is my aim. So there are a series of these very long horizontal paintings by by Courbet that, like the burial at Ornans, try to expound his ideas. And this one is very personal because it's called The Artist's Studio, a real allegory summing up 7 years of my artistic and moral life. These long subtitles from 1854. This shows Courbet in his studio. He's at his easel, he's painting. He has a nude model who's acting sort of as a muse. There's a young boy looking up. And everybody in this painting, on the left side and on the right side, there's a division, but everybody can be identified here as people who are either embracing the idea of realism. For example, this is Baudelaire here. or those who were still clinging to romantic traditions of themes that came from history and religion and mythology. Most of those people are pushed over on the left side of the painting. There are several clues to interpreting the painting, but just to read you this one description from Courbet himself, it's the whole world coming to me to be painted. On the right, all of the shareholders. By that, I mean friends, fellow workers, art lovers. On the left is the other world of everyday life, the masses, wretchedness, poverty, wealth, the exploited and the exploiters, people making a living from death. So as I said, on the right, you can identify the people that he felt were his sort of colleagues. The philosopher Proudhon, Champfleury is in that part of the painting. Baudelaire, I've already mentioned. And then on the other side, there are aspects and elements like these, this guitar and this feathered hat, and all of these things that speak back to the tradition that Courbet is negating, the romantic tradition, the Three Musketeers and all that stuff. That's not what he wants to paint anymore. So the painting is and was meant to be an allegory, but an allegory of his own and a personal sort of manifesto. When he attempted to exhibit the painting at the Salon, of course, he was roundly rejected. And so it was intended for the 1855 Universal Exposition. So Courbet rebelled to the fact that it had been rejected, and he decided to create his own exhibition and to create his own pavilion, which he titled and he paid for this at his own expense, which he titled the Pavilion of Realism, a place where people could come and see art that meant something to society. A few details before we get to the pavilion. Here you see some of the elements that are portrayed left and right. The child may be interpreted as the innocent eye of the painter, the muse inspiring the painter. This painting has been dissected and the symbolism has been explored on numerous occasions. This is Courbet's The Bathers from 1853, and I brought back the burial at Ornans. Again, Courbet had previously shown works in the Salon, and in fact, they did include the burial at Ornans and the Bathers, but the works caused a scandal. They seem to be questioning the hierarchy of genres, like painting a nude on the left, devoid of any mythology. This isn't Venus or Daphne or somebody. It's just a nude out in the forest, and the question is, what the heck's she doing out there nude? And it makes people needed a story. They needed an explanation. Oh, okay, I get it. It's Diana and she's looking for Endymion or something like that. But that was not what Courbet was catering to. So he built this pavilion. Don't be fooled. It's not like all concrete. It was basically sort of a canvas sort of structure, but it looked very, very substantial. This was the Pavilion of Realism from 1855. And so this was the sort of pivotal clarion call for realism. Now, at the time that Courbet was promoting realism, of course, a younger artist was on the scene, and that was Manet. So this is Manet's photograph by Nadar on the left of Manet from 1867. And just a gorgeous portrait by Henri Fantin-Latour of Manet. It's in the Art Institute from 1867. Manet was at the peak of his notoriety when Fantin-Latour exhibited this portrait, which is now in 1867. So it's some 10 years or so after the Pavilion of Realism. Manet himself chose not to submit any work that year to the Salon. He had all of his work rejected the previous year in 1866. And what we see is Fantin-Latour portraying Manet in a very particular kind of pose or symbol, and that is as what Baudelaire called a flaneur. And a flaneur meant a person of the boulevards, a person who enjoyed the urban life, who walked the streets, who window shopped, who sat in cafes and went to restaurants. Most Parisian apartments are small, and people lived out and about in the city, especially in Paris. So for many people, Fantin-Latour's portrait was Manet here shown as a flaneur. as a painter of modern life. The other interesting thing is, of course, he doesn't show himself as some kind of bohemian. He's perfectly dressed, perfectly attired, has his walking stick, his gloves. I mean, this is not somebody who thinks of himself as some kind of crazy bohemian like Courbet. He's not tearing off his hair. Uh, so here's a painting we have at the gallery, The Old Musician by Manet from 1862. With this painting, he didn't even try to give it to submit it to the Salon, nor did he try to submit it to any other exhibition. In fact, he exhibited it at a private gallery in 1863. But this is exactly the kind of painting hot on the heels of Courbet. And for Manet, Courbet was a tremendous inspiration. This is the kind of painting that people in Paris, most people, found absolutely horrific. First of all, which you can't tell from a slide, although you can see the painting in the gallery, it's very large. It's not small, it's very large. And that scale in itself asserted the idea that this kind of subject, this is a subject of street people. These are the people in Paris that everybody avoided and walked around and walked over. The beggars, the performers, all of the people that most of the Parisians were always annoyed with, the street urchins, the rag pickers, all of that. And these were the people that Manet knew the best because his studio was in the poorest part of Paris, in what was known as the Pigalle and the Polonia, the old Poland section of town. So he had to pass these people every day. I mean, he knew them very well. So we can identify most of the people in this painting, and we know that the seated musician with the guitar, with the violin, is Jean Legrain. He was a local Roma individual who had a little band, a little street band. And he also earned a living as an organ grinder and as an artist model. The man in the top hat to the right in the background his name was Collardet. He was a rag picker. He made money by picking up scraps of rags and then selling them. He was also an ironmonger, so he made works from iron. The man with the turban and the long robe at the far right is represented, and we know who he was. His name was Guerrero. But Manet, in a notebook, when he was writing about this painting and he was sort of identifying the characters, he listed that person in his notebook as, quote, an old Jew with a white beard, unquote, which has led art historians to believe that what he was trying to portray here in that figure was the biblical concept of the wandering Jew. And that's probably what he was showing, the man who is rootless, who has no home, who moves from place to place. Now, this painting, it was directly indebted to Velasquez, and an artist that Manet greatly admired was Velasquez, even before he took his first trip to Spain. And this was Velasquez's Los Borrachos, the Drunkards, or the Triumph of Bacchus from 1629. So this was thought to be, in the 19th century, a realistic scene of a country festival somewhere in Spain, somewhat like the Dutch painted the idea of the jolly topers, that kind of idea. But in fact, that's not what it is at all. What it is a bunch of Spaniards dressing up in costume and getting blitzed. So what's interesting is this figure, this young man who's supposed to be like Bacchus, and then this older figure here. And this is important because the older figure pushes forward a little vessel of wine, which is essentially saying to us, come and join the party. It's an invitation for us to come into this group of rather sort of straggly, but certainly colorful characters. It's interesting, when Velasquez painted this, drunkenness was regarded in Spain as a contemptible vice. So the term borracho was not flattering. It was one of the most scathing of insults. And that this painting even relates to the Italian painter Caravaggio before Velasquez, who had portrayed a Bacchus figure that looked very similar to this young boy here. So as I said, we can identify the characters. The figure on the right that I mentioned from the painting, this guy, had actually been painted by Manet earlier here. So the painting on the left is the Absinthe Drinker from 1859. And he just recycled that guy and brought him into the Old Musician. And there you see the detail and you see the wandering Jew figure. So the Absinthe Drinker, the painting on the left, is a full-length portrait of an alcoholic who is, as I said, a rag picker named Colladere. Everybody knew him in that area. He hung around outside of the Louvre very often. This painting was submitted by Manet to the Salon of 1859, and it was rejected. There was a jury that would select the paintings to be accepted for that year. They would judge the paintings. And what's very interesting is on the jury that year was the French Romantic painter Eugène Delacroix. And when the votes came in, the only artist on the committee who voted to take the painting into the Salon was Delacroix. He saw in it something quite special, but he was overruled by his colleagues. In a review of the 1846 Salon, Baudelaire urged artists to depict, quote, the heroism of modern life. And Manet embodied Baudelaire's ideal painter of contemporary Paris, the seemingly casual gathering that's composed here of the urban poor, the dispossessed. These are all the people who were dispossessed by Baron Haussmann's renovation of Paris. All these neighborhoods and all these areas where these people lived were being razed to the ground. And these people who now had been pushed to the margins, even more so, they had no place to even live except on the streets. So it's not anecdotal, it's not sentimental, it's essentially there's a kind of a careful neutrality of an unbiased looker for the most part. You'll notice the bottle on the foreground on the left of absinthe. Absinthe, of course, figures prominently throughout the history of the 19th century. It was the preferred drink of certainly most artists and, shall we say, bohemians, whatever that means, but not just them, even in the higher realms of society. It was extremely dangerous and toxic because of the wormwood that was in it. It could cause hallucinations, etc. I once gave an entire lecture just on absinthe, but that's not today. So there was another, in addition to the term flaneur, which was somebody who moved through the streets and went window shopping, there was another French term. It was called a badaud. And a badaud, unlike a flaneur, a badaud just sat in one place. He was considered a gawker. So he would like just sit on the edge of a fountain or maybe in a cafe, and he wouldn't move around the city. He would let the city move in front of him. So here's some photographs specifically of Jean Le Grain. These were taken when he was about 66 years old. Here again, now, in our exhibition, one of the buildings that does figure prominently in the beginning when you're in the first couple of rooms is the Palace of Industry. In fact, we have this photograph on the left on the wall in the exhibition. And this is in Paris, it dates to 1855. And on the right, I'm showing you what a salon style hanging would be, but this is Italian. Well, it's by an Italian artist, but it depicts the Louvre. It's the exposition of the Salon at the Louvre in 1787, so right around the time of the French Revolution. So in 1863, the official Salon rejected 3,000 pieces of art submitted out of 5,000 that had been submitted. And there was a furor that erupted among artists, among the public. It was it was raucous, it was mocking, it could be very caustic. And so in a kind of half sort of mocking way, Napoleon III said, well, okay, everybody's upset. We turned away all these pictures. Let's have I'll give you guys another venue. So this would be the Salon des Refusés, the Salon of the garbage. This is the stuff that couldn't make it into the official Salon. So now everybody, because it was labeled that, everybody wanted to see what was all the bad stuff in here. And why is it all controversial? And what am I going to see? Am I going to have a stroke or something? So the way the work was hung was similar to what you see on the right, although there was a little more sort of attempt to make things a little more spacious and viewable. But there were a lot of works that had been rejected. So what are some of the works that had been rejected? Well, these two works. The Déjeuner sous l'herbe, of course, by Manet was submitted and rejected. Whistler's White Girl that we now have at the National Gallery was submitted and that was rejected. So it was a number of great artists who then made this Salon, the Refusés, very impressive. Today, actually, very few people look at the Salon of 1863. Everybody looks at the Salon, the Refusés. Now here is a photograph of Emile Zola on the left. It's undated, but it probably dates to maybe 1895 or so. That is the date of the photograph on the right. Zola is a fascinating character and a brilliant man, a man of many talents, a man of tremendous importance in French literature, in French politics, in French art. He was, of course, considered a naturalist, and there's always a discussion about what's the difference between a naturalist and a realist, but for our purposes, they're relatively interchangeable. He wrote a series of novels. He was like Balzac. He didn't like write one novel a year or 2 years. He would write like 10 in a month. So his work is incredibly voluminous, and part of it, the most important work, is where he traces the history of a family through many generations, and that became one of the most important examples of French naturalist literature. But one of the things that Zola was interested in, he was interested in the natural sciences, in science in general. He wanted to bring to literature something that was, again, much like what Courbet had achieved, something that was real, that was unadulterated, not sort of watered down. He was interested in the human condition, the maladies, the obsessions, the addictions, inherited traits, disease. This is what he thought of was important as a model of contrasting all of that to the idea of human freedom and of the idea of an individualist ethos. So realism attempted, if I try to make some distinctions here, realism attempted to depict things as they are, which contrasted with the previously dominant aesthetic of Romanticism, which was totally sort of fictional in its narratives. Naturalism certainly attempts to depict things realistically, but there's a social component to it, and that's the idea that people's lives are the way they are because there's a determinism. There's a social kind of Darwinian sort of determinism that forces people into situations. So the themes and these people, all of us, we're not always able to resist these circumstances. And Zola certainly isn't writing from a place of exaltation and sort of castigating these people. He sees himself as part of that group. So in his novels, you find themes of alcoholism, drug addiction, prostitution, domestic violence, unfair labor laws. These are all subjects for entire novels. The plight of the workers, all of this. So naturalism often focused on a certain determinism, or you might say it in a different way, the inability of human beings to resist a biological, social, and economic force that is dictating their behavior and their fate. So Zola writes about what he's trying to attempt, comparable to what Courbet was saying in his manifesto. And Zola says, I don't need to plead for modern subjects here. This cause was won a long time ago. After those remarkable works by Edouard Manet and Courbet, no one would now dare to say that the present day is unworthy of being painted. We find ourselves forced with the only reality. In spite of ourselves, we encourage our painters to portray us just as we are, with our styles of dress and our manners. That last phrase is almost a plagiarism of Baudelaire, who in the Heroism of Modern Life says that we are heroic right down to our patent leather shoes. And Zola kind of does a little riff on that idea. So Manet had his work cut out for him. Of course, the Déjeuner sous l'herbe was rejected, but it then makes its appearance at the Salon of Refusés. And what Manet is trying to do is to sort of create and educate a public about where these paintings come from, and they're not as daring as you might think. So, of course, the comparison to Titian's Pastoral Concert, which was in the Louvre, so it was a painting Manet knew intimately. But people, they weren't into this kind of subtlety. Like, okay, yeah, well, he's quoting an old master. He's just modernizing it. That myth on the right was important, that this was a pastoral Roman Arcadian theme. But Zola was very active as an art critic and as a journalist. So he wrote on almost every exhibition, review, salon, and otherwise. And he talks about the Luncheon on the Grass, and he says, the Luncheon on the Grass is the greatest work of Edouard Manet, one in which he realizes the dream of all painters, to place figures of natural grandeur in a landscape. We know the power with which he vanquished this difficulty. There are some leaves, some tree trunks, and in the background, a river in which a chemise-wearing woman bathes. In the foreground, two young men are seated across from a second woman who has just exited the water and who dries her naked skin in the open air. This nude woman has scandalized the public, who see only her in the canvas. My God, what indecency! A woman without the slightest covering between two clothed men. That has never been seen. So he's mocking this, and this belief is a gross error. For in the Louvre, there are more than 50 paintings in which are found mixes of persons clothed and nude. But no one goes to the Louvre to be scandalized. The crowd has kept itself, moreover, from judging the Luncheon on the Grass like a veritable work of art should be judged. They see in it only some people who are having a picnic, finishing bathing, and they believed that the artist had placed an obscene intent in the disposition of the subject, while the artist had simply sought to obtain vibrant oppositions and a straightforward audience. This defense of Manet goes on much longer, and I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but Zola's defense of Manet is very important in this context, and it will continue. And again, the references that Manet was making to, for example, Titian, but also to a print after Raphael, Marc-Antonio Raimondi's Judgment of Paris, where Manet essentially lifted this grouping and then modernized them in the painting. So he's creating a kind of modern lineage, you might say. And here's what I'm talking about, the way he was quoting the past. But the general public didn't really pick up on this, and if they did, they couldn't have cared less. When the emperor, of course, Emperor Napoleon, saw Manet's Déjeuner sous l'herbe, he was shocked by its undisguised sexuality, and agreed with the Academy that the Salon of Refusés should also be the last. That should be the first in 1863, and after that, we're shutting it down. But the controversy stirred a real debate over the nature of modern art, and eventually opened the way for a different salon. And this is getting related to the Impressionists, the Salon des Indépendants, the Independent Salon, and other institutions that eventually began to rival the salon, the official salon, for attention. So here is Manet is a great still life painter, and he creates some of the most beautiful still lifes. This whole picnic scene, the basket of fruit and the blankets and everything is just gorgeous. So people hated the Déjeuner sous l'herbe. I mean, they really hated it. And they didn't think, well, he can't do anything worse than that. And then he did. He followed it up with this painting of Olympia from 1863. And of course, this is where everything started crumbling. Zola had predicted in that long entry that I was reading to you, I didn't read all the way down to that part, that at one point Manet's painting of the Déjeuner sous l'herbe would hang in the Louvre. And he's right. He was correct in that. That's at the Musée d'Orsay now, but it did for a time hang there. So his judgments were particularly invaluable certainly as far as Manet was concerned. So in the Manet Olympia, 1863, this is where Manet, the critical response was so overwhelming that Manet could barely crawl out from under it. And at one point he says, quote, "The insults rain down on me like hail." And he wrote that to Baudelaire. How am I going to get out of this jam? I have often told people that in the history of Western painting, there is no more reviled artist in his lifetime than Manet. Nobody comes close. Not Picasso, not Francis Bacon, you name the most controversial artists you know. None of them were treated as badly as Manet was during his lifetime. So people looked upon the Olympia as a symbol of depravity. She looked like a corpse. She was a cadaver. And this was Manet declaring that it was his masterpiece. And Zola agreed. And Zola said about the Olympia, he said, quote, "It will endure as the characteristic expression of his talent, as the highest mark of his power. When other artists correct nature by painting Venus, they lie. Manet asked himself why he should lie. Why not tell the truth?" So again, Manet was trying to echo past traditions. He was giving it his best shot to create a kind of historical lineage. Titian's Venus of Urbino, the Goya nude Maha. The Goya is particularly relevant to the Manet because she looks straight out and she has a very open pose. She's not trying to cloak her nakedness. Now, it's interesting that the Olympia caused Napoleon to have a sort of coronary. But the painting in that same exhibition that he liked, and he liked it so much that he purchased it for the government, was this painting by Alexandre Cabanel, another of the great academicians like Bouguereau. This is The Birth of Venus from 1863. This was the great success of the Paris Salon of 63. Napoleon liked it so much, he immediately purchased it for his own personal collection. He then promoted Cabanel and made him the professor at the École des Beaux-Arts. Now, this is, if anything, more provocative than the Olympia. She stretches out, she's open to us, she has this kind of come hither kind of look. But because it's Venus, okay, it's Venus, that's okay. And it's got little pooty figures flying around. So as a man, especially in terms of the male gaze, it's okay. I can look at this and not feel guilty. I can look at this and not feel like I'm some kind of a pervert or something, because it's classical. It's Venus. It's not Olympia. Olympia was a prostitute, and everybody knew that she was a prostitute, and most of the men had visited her. So that's a whole different thing. So one of the great art historians of the 19th century, for whom, I mean, a modern art historian who wrote about the 19th century, is Robert Rosenblum. And he said about The Birth of Venus that, quote, "This Venus hovers somewhere between an ancient deity and a modern dream. There's an ambiguity of her eyes that seem to be closed, but that a close look reveals that she is awake. A nude who could be asleep or awake is especially formidable for a male viewer." As for Zola, he said, quote, "I know that the crowd would scorn me if it heard me, but I affirm that the canvases of Cabanel will pale and die of anemia before more or less 25 years from now, while the paintings of Manet will flourish throughout the years with the eternal youth of original artworks." And he was absolutely correct. Today, very few people know Cabanel. An artist that Zola hated, in keeping with this tradition, was Cabanel. I just read you one of his diatribes. This is a portrait, self-portrait of Cabanel from 1852. And then this is a painting on the right of Tamar and Absalom, 1875. So here's what was expected: a biblical, historical, religious painting. It could be as exotic and erotic as you want. Women could be flying off the bed, guys could be hanging off the ceiling, but as long as it was biblical, okay, that's okay. And then that gives me permission as a male gazer, viewer, that I can look at it and say, well, yeah, I studied the Bible. When Zola saw this painting of Absalom and Tamar, he wrote, quote, "It is a composition without defect or merit. The most inimical mediocrity speaks through it. It is an art made up of all the old formulas, renewed by the able hand of a worker's apprentice. So obviously, and this is the guy now who had just been promoted by Napoleon to be a full professor at the École des Beaux-Arts. Now, the Olympia was, in terms of talking about Manet's scathing reviews and caricatures and the attacks, every day he woke up to a new attack. And there were so many journals in Paris at this time, so many magazines. And this was one journal from May 27, 1865. And the inscription below reads that essentially it says that that Olympia needs a bath. But what he writes is that Manet, or the wife of the ébéniste by Manet, the French word for cabinet maker is derived from ebony, so ébéniste. How like a bouquet of flowers. This picture by Monsieur Manet is the flower of the exhibition. Monsieur Courbet is outdistanced by the overall length of the famous black cat. The great colorist has chosen to depict this lady just when she is about to take a highly necessary bath. Here, the Olympia is derided on the left by a critic, and especially everybody got really freaked out by the cat. The cat's tail, or the coal peddler of the Batignolles. Everyone admires this beautiful coal woman whose modest contours have never been exposed to so common a place liquid as water. Let us admit it boldly, the coal woman, her wrapped bouquet, Monsieur Manet and his cat are the lions of the Salon of 1865. Another in reference to the image at the right. This Olympia is a sort of female gorilla, a grotesque in India rubber outlined in black apes on a bed in a state of complete nudity. The horizontal attitude of Titian's Venus, the right arm rests on the body in the same fashion, except for the hand, which is flexed in a sort of shameless contraction. And what is the reference there is to when you looked at Titian's Venus of Urbino, she has her hand just gently over her genital area. It's just laying on top. And in the case of Monet's Olympia, her hand is pressed into her into that genital area. It's actually one of the three-dimensional parts of the painting. She presses her hand in, and that absolutely freaked people out. Now, I want to talk about something else that was very important to all these artists and to Manet and Goya, not Goya, it was important to Goya, but Manet and Zola. And that is the Paris morgue. So here on the left, we have an interior view of the old morgue of Paris from 1845. And on the right, we have Manet's Dead Christ with Angels from 1864. The pose of his dead Christ seated upwards and frontal comes right out of the way people used to visit the morgue to see the cadavers. And in fact, the interesting thing about the Manet painting, first of all, Baudelaire pointed out that he put the wound on the wrong side. And then Manet said, oh, geez, maybe I should change it. And then Baudelaire said, no, forget it, leave it the way it is. But one of the most entertaining activities in Paris, which is why we have so many references to cadavers, corpses, the color of death when we look at these reviews, was the viewing of dead bodies in the morgue. So this was like on Sunday, let's go look at dead bodies. First we go to church, then we go to the morgue. So the pose of this Christ figure by Manet is clearly referencing the fact that he's been to the morgue and has seen these cadavers. And I won't go into more detail about the wound and all of that. When Baudelaire warned Manet about the wound, he did warn him. He said it's going to give the malicious something to laugh at. People are going to laugh at you because you didn't have the wound in the same place, in the right place. And at that point, Manet was so shell shocked he really didn't care. So the morgue and the salon, by mid-century, were both places of Parisian entertainment. You would go to the salon and look at paintings, and then you would go to the morgue. In May 1864, they opened up a new morgue in Paris, part of Haussmann's new revival of Paris. It was a real public exhibition. There was a real public exhibition space. That's what you're seeing here. Oh, sorry. This is the exhibition space. It was open daily. It was free, sort of like the National Gallery. And it exhibited dead bodies displayed on a slanted marble table behind glass. Exposed for several days, of course, the naked corpses had to be somewhat refreshed, and there was a slight trickle of water that would come down on the slab. The whole word morgue comes from the old French moguer, which means to look at solemnly. So here is the Palace of Industry I already mentioned to you at the left. And this was the new morgue on the right that you see. It was at the edge of the city. It was at the edge of the Ile de Cité, just behind Notre Dame in Paris. Today, it's that square park called the Ile de France. It was a real public exhibition space. It was open daily, free. It exhibited these dead bodies, everything that I mentioned. Here's a better photograph. So Haussmann's urban renewal of Paris had provided an improved viewing. He thought, well, let's make the morgue more accessible. He improved the public viewing space at the morgue. He improved the building. All these things. He improved the building, and especially the area near the morgue, where many of the bodies that they got for the morgue were fished out of the Seine, where they were processed. Now, Zola, in his novels, is referring to all of this in his novels. If you know Zola's work, he is looking at everything around him. And in his 1867 novel, Therese Raquin, he says, quote, "The morgue is a show that anyone can afford, which poor and rich passers-by get for free. The door is open, anyone can come in there. There are connoisseurs who go out of their way not to miss one of those spectacles of death. When the slabs are empty, people go out disappointed, robbed, muttering under their breath. When the slabs are well filled, and when there is a fine display of human flesh, the visitors crowd in, getting a cheap thrill, horrified, joking, applauding, or whistling, as in the theater, and go away contented, announcing that the morgue has been a success that day." So Zola gives us some of the most poignant and specific discussions of the morgue and the role it played in Parisian society. He goes, this was a place you would bring your children. You go get an ice cream cone, and then you stop off at the morgue. And continuing Zola's description, women came in great numbers, pink young working girls in white blouses and clean skirts, who went briskly from one end of the window to the other, attentive and wide-eyed, as though looking at the display in a fashion store. There were working class women too, haggard with doleful expressions, as well, and well-dressed ladies, nonchalant, trailing their silk dresses. So here's two other images of the morgue, showing how people came to observe things. So more than 40,000 people came to see the fabulous show at the morgue every day at the end of the 19th century. It became a key foreign site. It was in their tour books. So when you wanted to know what to see in Paris, that was one of the leading things. It was particularly popular with the British tourists. Foreign tourists came, they mingled with, they brought their children, workers came on their lunch break. Elderly who had nothing better to do hung out at the morgue. It did become a major tourist attraction, kind of like right below the Eiffel Tower, which hadn't been built yet, by the way. But part of its function was to provide an opportunity for people to claim the bodies of suicides and murder victims. In other words, families who lost somebody who had committed suicide, maybe he or she had thrown themselves into the Seine, or they had committed suicide, they had no identification papers or anything. Those people would be brought to the morgue and on display, and then families would come to see if they could claim one of those people. Yes, that was my father, that was my wife, whatever. And of course, by the time they were fished out of the Seine, their bodies were bloated from drowning, they were hideously disfigured, and they were kept naked, they were presented naked except for a piece of leather covering their loins. Zola, again, talking about the morgue, he says, he really liked the place. He says, a show that was affordable to all. His visits, and he's referencing one of the characters in his novel when he says his visits to the morgue gave him nightmares and fits of shuddering, which left him panting for breath. He shook off his fears and told himself not to act like a child. He wanted to be strong, but despite himself, the body refused, and his whole being was overcome by revulsion and horror as soon as he found himself in the damp, sickly, smelling atmosphere of the mortuary. Now, death is a theme throughout the 19th century, and certainly Manet portrays it in a number of ways. And I'm coming up to my time limit here. So pretty soon I'll be looking like this guy on the screen. So this is Manet's The Dead Toreador, which we have here at the National Gallery, probably from 1864. But we know that this painting was part of a larger painting. In 1864, Manet submitted a painting called Episode at the Bullfight to the Salon, and it was rejected and it was ridiculed. And so he was so upset, he took the painting back to his studio and he cut it into two pieces. And then he repainted the top part and the bottom part, and he discarded certain sections of it. Today, the part of this painting that was on the top originally is in the Frick collection. But we'll get to that in a second. There had been images of death and dying soldiers. And this is a painting in the 19th century that was thought to be by Velasquez, but it's not. It's an Italian, probably a Neapolitan painter from the 17th century. So there were these images of these bodies laid out on a death field. Here are the two pieces of the painting on the right. Today, to see the painting on the top, you go to the Frick, and then our painting is on the bottom. At one time, they were the same part of the painting. We lost a couple of sections that I'll show you in a minute. We have no reference to what this work looked like from any critic. All we have is this cartoon on the left. This was a caricature. The cartoonist came to the exhibition. He saw the painting. He was appalled by it. And he did this sketch making fun of how stiff and rigid the body was. And people used to say that Courbet, Manet's bodies looked like dolls, or that they were totally inanimate looking. And so that's the way we sense what this painting originally looked like. Now, not too long ago, we brought the Frick painting here and attempted to reconstruct what the painting would have looked like. So here is the Frick painting on the top with our painting on the bottom. That white area is all the part of the painting that Manet discarded once he cut the painting. But when you x-ray the paintings, they fit right together. So when you x-ray the Frick painting on the top with our painting at the bottom, you see what was missing, the top of the bull and all the other aspects of the matadors. And so it's a fascinating, again, reference to Manet's love of Spain, first and foremost. He took his first trip to Spain in 1865, and he spent his entire time at the Prado. He never left the Prado. And he looked at Velasquez and he looked at Goya very carefully. This is Manet's painting from the gallery here, The Tragic Actor from 1866. And this is Velasquez's painting of Pablo de Valladolid from 1636 at the Prado. When Manet, remember, and I talked about this earlier this year when we had our Sargent show, we did a show about Sargent in Spain, and I talked about the fixation that artists had with Spain in this period. Remember, there was a cult of things Spanish in France. There was Prosper Mérimée Carmen, then Bizet's Carmen, all of the Goya's work, etc. The Spanish gallery was founded at the Louvre at this time. But in any case, when Manet went to the Prado and saw Velasquez now for the very first time live, he wrote to Baudelaire and he said, quote, "At last I know Velasquez, and I declare that he is the greatest painter that ever existed." He was so spellbound by this portrait on the right that he writes to his friend Fantin-Latour, and he says, quote, "The most astonishing piece of this splendid oeuvre, and perhaps the most extraordinary piece of painting that has ever been done, is the picture described in the catalog as the portrait of a celebrated actor of the time of Philip IV. The background disappears. There's nothing but air surrounding the fellow who is all in black and appears alive." Manet thought this painting was the greatest painting ever painted by Velasquez. Of course, he was a great student of Velasquez throughout his life. And that brings us to one of the great images that brings together Manet and Zola directly. This is Manet's portrait of Emile Zola on the left from 1868. Again, Zola was always interested in all those artists who had been rejected by the official critics. He came to their defense. And he wrote an article on Manet in a review, and he defended Manet against these charges that he was somehow incompetent. Zola regarded Manet, as I think we've already seen, as one of the true masters of the future, that he was perhaps ahead of his time, whose place was going to be in the Louvre. In 1867, this article was published, an article that he had written in one journal. He published it separately as a slim kind of brochure with a blue cover. And there it is. And the title of it was just Manet. So in actuality, that's how Manet signed that painting. So he wrote this defense of Manet, and then Manet was so moved by it that he approached Émile Zola and said, I'd like to paint your portrait. So the sittings took place in Manet's studio. The setting was arranged for the occasion with anything and everything that was characteristic of of Zola's personality, his tastes, his occupation. If you look carefully in these details on the walls, a reproduction of Manet's Olympia, a painting which sparked a fierce scandal, remember, in 1865, but which Zola had held out to be Manet's best work. Then there's an engraving from Velasquez's Bacchus behind there as well, the borrachos that I've already showed you. There are numerous references to Japanese prints that were very popular with Manet and the Impressionists. That's a Kuniaki print that you see on the desk. The whole panel and the scroll and the element here of the screen all echo this sort of Far East influence. Manet is holding, or Zola, Manet has Zola holding a book, and we can read what the book is. It's a book by a man named Charles Blanc, and it was a book called The History of Painting, and that was a book that we know Manet constantly read and referred to in his conversations. So this was the great homage and the great joining together of Zola and Manet. Now, if we think again of the great novels by Emile Zola, like L'Assommoir here on the left and Nana on the right, 1877 and 1880, this was part of that 20 novel cycle. So Zola gave Balzac a run for his money in producing novels about tracing the history of a family through the decades. It was published in 1877. Each novel dealt with a character, and then it was like it's going to see a soap opera. The next volume would pick up where the characters left off. And Nana is introduced early. She's introduced in L'Assommoir, which is really a discussion of alcoholism, because she comes from her father is an alcoholic. She rises up from a streetwalker to a kind of high class prostitute. And so there's this great interconnection of all these characters and novels. And here you see Nana portrayed by Manet on the right from 1877. So he's literally portraying her as she's discussed in the novel. And then, of course, the great railway painting that we have that's in the exhibition, 1873. And so while the Impressionists were preparing for their first exhibition, Manet was completing his submissions for the 1874 Salon, which included this painting of ours. And again, it was a totally modern portrayal of a woman and a child at the Gare Saint-Lazare, the busiest railway station in Paris. But everything about the painting alienated people. They hated it. First of all, what are they doing there? Or who is this woman? Why is the kid turned away? We can't see her face. The back is just a bunch of smoke. They look like they're in jail. All of this was just heaped on Manet. And what's interesting is that he was painting, to paint this picture, he walked outside of his studio, walked across the railroad tracks, and looked back at his studio. And his studio was right up there. So he was painting in his own neighborhood. He just walked across the railroad tracks and painted this painting that, of course, just totally offended everybody. But by this time, he's kind of used to it. Well, that's not true. He really never got used to it. Nana, of course, was equally vilified as being, quote, precociously immoral. Was how one critic described her. And of course, the word Nana has become in contemporary French, it's a form of a mildly rude French term for a woman in English, I guess we would say abroad, you know, that kind of term. The great Manet painting that we have here of Plum Brandy, painted in the same cafe where Degas painted his great masterpiece, In a Cafe or Absent on the left. Degas derived a lot of inspiration from Manet because, like Manet, he was interested in the real world and even in its darker sort of seamier sides. The painting on the right that we have is filled with tropes that any contemporary Parisian would have taken note of. So there are all kinds of hidden clues here. First of all, this is a woman in a cafe by herself. That's not allowed. Secondly, she's smoking. That's not allowed. Thirdly, she has an alcoholic drink in front of her. That's not allowed. Fourthly, she's looking out as if to look for somebody who might come by that she could interest. And if she could interest some man in having some kind of relationship, then she could perhaps earn more money because she's probably a seamstress or a laundress. And this is the way they try to sort of supplement their income. Most people looking at that painting by Manet would have known exactly what it was about. Of course, the Dreyfus Affair, which Zola was famous for, and it did affect the French Impressionists because they all took sides in this affair. So this is Alfred Dreyfus on the left from 1894. And this was the famous article that Zola wrote. It's the front page of the newspaper Aurora from January 13th, 1898, which he begins with this famous phrase, j'accuse, I accuse. And he accuses, this is a letter written to the president of the Republic, accusing him of anti-Semitism and of all of these violations of human rights. Now, Zola and the Impressionists tended to go their separate ways. Zola was very close to Manet, but he wasn't as close to the other Impressionists. Dreyfus was a French Jewish army officer. He was convicted of treason. There was a controversy that surrounded the case, and it went on for 12 years, and it became a divisive moment in French history. The arguments about the Dreyfus Affair were on every aspect of French society. Early in the proceedings, Zola, who followed the trial and all of the documents and discussions, he was convinced that Dreyfus was innocent. And then he published this open letter vehemently denouncing the War Office. And it's today is simply known by this phrase, I accuse. This event divided everybody in Paris. You could not be neutral. In the case of the Impressionists, Monet and Pissarro, and Pissarro was also Jewish, sided with Zola. So they were staunchly pro-Dreyfus. And so was Mary Cassatt, despite the fact that actually she was an anti-Semite. But in this case, she was pro-Dreyfus. Monet went to Zola, congratulating him on his courage to write what he wrote. But many more artists, including Cézanne, Renoir, Rodin, Degas, were staunchly anti-Dreyfus. They all were, to a large extent, anti-Semitic. Renoir even spoke out against Pissarro, who was his friend, because he was Jewish. So Degas, of course, was notorious as an anti-Semite. In the years following the Dreyfus Affair, Degas shunned Pissarro. He dismissed his work as unworthy and ignoble. And once he had praised his works highly and no longer. Manet wasn't caught up in this because Manet had died in 1883. So he was sort of spared this turmoil and the effects that it had on the Impressionists. This is one of Manet's greatest late paintings, and it's a masterpiece that I'm not going to talk about, except to say a couple of things. And that gets us back to this bar. This is the bar at the Folies Bergère by Manet that's at the Courtauld. And one of the most riveting parts of this painting is the still life. You can even see the Bass Ale, the creme de menthe, the oranges. When Zola saw this painting, Zola said, even the most determined enemies of Edouard Manet's talent admit that he paints inanimate objects well. It's a magnificent painting. This is a breathtaking painting. Here is Emile Zola on his deathbed in 1902. And this is Manet on his deathbed in 1883. In April of 1883, Manet's left foot was amputated because of gangrene caused probably by complications from syphilis, but also rheumatism. He died 11 days later on April 30th in Paris. Zola died at the age of 62, but in very curious circumstances. And even today, Zola scholars debate this. He and his wife, Alexandrine, returned to their house in Paris from a brief stay in the country. It was wet and cold, and there was a coal fire that was lit in their bedroom for the night. They slept with the window shut, and Zola locked the door, as he always did. He had been receiving an incredible number of death threats because of the Dreyfus Affair. Without realizing what was happening, Zola and Alexandrine were slowly overcome by carbon monoxide fumes. At 3 a.m, they were both awake, but they were both feeling sick. Zola stopped his wife from waking the servants for what he thought was merely an attack of indigestion. Later, when Zola tried to get out of bed, perhaps to open the window, Alexandrine was unable to move, and Zola fell to the floor. At 9 a.m., clearly there was something wrong, and his servants broke down the door. Zola was on the floor near death, and his wife was lying on her bed unconscious. Doctors arrived. They gave Zola artificial respiration for 20 minutes. His wife was taken to a clinic. She recovered, but Zola died on September 29th. On that happy note, let me end with this, which brings everybody together in a beautiful kind of finish. This is Fantin-Latour's painting of a studio in the Batignolles quarter of 1870. And it's a painting essentially of both Manet and Zola's legacy. Again, Manet died in 1883, but in this painting you see Manet at his studio surrounded by the artists that admired him, not just artists, but writers and poets. And so among the people here, this is Manet, this is Emile Zola, this is Claude Monet, this is Frederic Bazille, this is Renoir. So they're all here around Manet almost as his acolytes, because the thing to remember is that Manet never exhibited with the Impressionists. Despite their attempts to get him to be part of their group, he refused. He supported them. He admired them. He was like a caring father, did whatever he could to help them. But Manet never relinquished his desire to have official recognition in the French salons, in the salons that were sponsored by the government. So even though Manet was closely tied to these individuals, technically, literally, he never was in any of the Impressionist exhibitions. But by the end of Manet's life, interestingly enough, you do find his paintings of open air scenes at Argenteuil and other places, because by that time he then at least they said to him, look, okay, we know you don't want to be part of our group, that's okay, but just come out and paint with us. And so he did. And so Manet's style towards the last years of his life did reflect the influence of these younger artists. Thanks very much. I'll leave it there.